Take a second and think about the last time you sat across from someone at dinner. Watch their hands move, listen to the pitch of their voice shift, and realized within 6 seconds that every single word coming out of their mouth was a carefully engineered lie designed to manage your perception of them. Now, ask yourself what happens when you can't turn that setting off. Most people treat human connection like air. They breathe it in passively, take whatever quality is available, and panic the moment the room gets quiet. They will tolerate manipulation, hidden agendas, subtle disrespect, and endless visual signaling just to avoid sitting alone in a room with their own mind. They mistake proximity for intimacy and noise for connection. But there is a very specific type of person, a rare behavioral profile, that hits a tipping point. They don't start out isolated. In fact, early in life, they are often hyper-observant, highly empathetic, and deeply attuned to the micro-behaviors of everyone around them. They learn to read a room before they even learn to sit quietly in it. But eventually, a critical shift occurs. They begin to notice the exact cost of every conversation, every friendship, and every social obligation they maintain. They calculate the cognitive overhead required to tolerate performative friendship, and they realize the return on investment is fundamentally zero. So they do something that looks like insanity to the average person. They pull the plug. They don't throw a fit. They don't make a scene on social media. They just quietly, systematically step back until their inner circle shrinks down to a head count of 0. To the outside world, this looks like depression, social anxiety, or failure. Psychologists who only read textbooks call it withdrawal. But if you examine the behavioral mechanics under a microscope, you discover something entirely different. This isn't retreat. It's the final evolutionary stage of a mind that has outgrown the default settings of human interaction. If you are watching this, chances are you felt that exact shift happening inside yourself. You've noticed the silence getting louder, your tolerance for superficial chatter hitting absolute 0, and your circle shrinking to almost nothing. And right now, deep down, you're trying to figure out if you're breaking down or if you're finally stepping into the rarest, most dangerous stage of psychological sovereignty. Stay with me for the next few minutes. By the end of this breakdown, I'm going to show you the precise behavioral mechanics behind why this happens, the exact psychological threshold you crossed without realizing it, and why this terrifying season of total isolation is actually the ultimate power dynamic reset you've been waiting for. Let's start with a hard truth about human mechanics. Most people do not want connection. They want a mirror. They want someone who reflects their insecurities back to them in a manageable way, validates their preferred delusions, and pretends that the social performance everyone is participating in actually means something. When you walk into a room, your brain is running subroutines whether you realize it or not. You are measuring baseline vocal tones, tracking eye microexpressions, assessing postural shifts, and mapping out the hidden power dynamics at play. For 99% of the population, these subroutines run in the background at low power. But for the rarest personality type, the hyper-observant, fully integrated outlier, those subroutines run in high definition, 24 hours a day. If you have reached the stage where you look at your life and realize you have no friends, no group chat blowing up your phone, no casual weekend plans, no inner circle to lean on, your instinct, programmed by a noisy world, is to assume something is deeply wrong with you. I am here to tell you that you are looking at the schematic upside down. By the time you finish listening to what I'm about to break down, you will understand that this total social solitude isn't a defect. It is the calculated, inevitable final phase of your psychological development. And if you pay close attention to the mechanics we're about to dissect, you will never look at your isolation as a weakness ever again. When you have built the capacity to observe human behavior without the filter of comfort, social interaction changes entirely. Average social dynamics rely on mutual blind spots. Person A pretends to care about Person B's status display. Person B pretends to respect Person A's performative advice. It's an unspoken contract. I won't point out your mask if you don't point out mine. When you mature into the highest tier of self-awareness and observational ability, you break that contract simply by existing. You see the micro-hesitation before someone answers a simple question. You catch the flash of contempt hidden behind a polite smile. You notice when someone is using you as an emotional trash can to dump their unprocessed anxiety. Once your brain registers these signals in high definition, you can no longer unsee them. Trying to sit through a casual happy hour becomes the cognitive equivalent of listening to fingernails dragging across a chalkboard in a room full of toxic exhaust. The energy cost exceeds the value of the interaction every single time. Isolation isn't caused by an inability to connect. It is caused by an inability to fake ignorance. There's a fascinating phenomenon that occurs when a high-level observer enters a standard social environment. I call it the human X-ray effect. Because you have audited your own mind, confronted your insecurities, mapped your flaws, and stopped lying to yourself, you carry a specific type of baseline calm. Your posture is settled. Your eyes don't dart around looking for approval. Your voice doesn't tilt up at the end of sentences to seek validation. Subconsciously, people pick up on this within milliseconds, and it frightens them. When an unintegrated person stands next to a fully integrated person, their subconscious mind registers a threat. They feel exposed. They sense that their usual social maneuvers, subtle guilt trips, and performative humble brags aren't working. Without you saying a single harsh word, your simple, quiet presence acts as a mirror that exposes everything they are trying to hide from themselves. The result? They will back away. They will call you intimidating, cold, or detached. They pull away because staying around you requires them to take off their mask, and most people would rather destroy a relationship than face their own unvarnished reality. This brings us to the final stage, the liminal desert. When you realize you can no longer participate in superficial relationships, a gap opens up. You step away from the crowd, but you haven't yet built your inner fortress. This is where most rare personalities panic. The silence feels heavy, the weekends feel long. The voice in your head asks, "Did I mess up? Am I broken?" This desert is the ultimate test of behavioral sovereignty. Most people break here. They can't handle the withdrawal from social validation, so they crawl back to toxic friend groups, answer texts from people they don't respect, and trade their peace for cheap company. But the rare personality type stays in the desert. They realize that solitude is the price of admission for self-mastery. In this total absence of external noise, they calibrate their internal compass. They stop reacting to external opinions. They learn to generate their own certainty, direct their own focus, and master their own mental state without relying on anyone else to validate their existence. Having no friends isn't your permanent destination. It is your reset button. It is the phase where you clear the board of low-value, high-friction noise so that if and when you choose to let someone into your space again, they are held to an entirely different standard. You no longer seek friends out of need. You select allies out of alignment. Until you meet people who operate at that level of self-mastery, quiet isolation is not a sacrifice. It is your ultimate strategic advantage. Embrace the quiet. Calibrate your mind. You aren't left behind. You've just reached the final stage. Extreme social detachment in rare personality archetypes isn't a symptom of social failure. It is an active behavioral filter designed to eliminate high-friction, low-signal human interactions. To understand why this detachment occurs, you have to look at the mechanical structure of how human beings process attention and energy. The average person navigates their day-to-day existence operating on an unspoken exchange system. They trade passive conversation, social validation, and surface-level loyalty for a sense of belonging, using these social rituals to keep their underlying anxieties at bay. For the majority of the population, this trade feels natural and necessary because the pain of feeling isolated far outweighs the discomfort of maintaining low-quality relationships. However, when an individual develops an exceptionally high degree of psychological maturity and observational awareness, that fundamental equation completely breaks down. When your baseline cognitive processing operates at an advanced level, every human interaction carries an observable energy transaction. You begin to instinctively calculate the friction involved in simple daily chatter, the subtle posturing, the hidden bids for attention, the passive-aggressive jockeying for dominance, and the repetitive emotional dumping that characterizes standard social circles. For most people, these micro-behaviors pass under the radar as background noise, but for a hyper-aware mind, they register like loud, harsh static. The rare personality type quickly realizes that almost all casual social engagement is inherently low signal. It contains virtually no actionable truth, no genuine intellectual depth, and no mutual growth. Instead, it is predominantly composed of noise designed to soothe the fragile egos of the participants involved. At this juncture, social isolation stops being a tragic accident or a symptom of depression and transforms into a deliberate, highly efficient filter. It is an intentional design choice aimed at preserving cognitive capital. When you come to understand that human attention is a zero-sum, non-renewable resource, spending that resource on managing the emotional turbulence and performative masks of acquaintances becomes mathematically irresponsible. The decision to step away from casual groups and fade out of wide social circles is not driven by anger, superiority, or bitterness. It is driven by the cold, clear realization that the cognitive overhead required to maintain those connections yields a zero or negative return on investment. Furthermore, this filter operates in both directions. It doesn't just keep the individual from reaching out, it actively repels those who rely on performative dynamics to survive. When a person no longer offers easy validation, no longer participates in gossip, and refuses to nod along to obvious self-deceptions, the surrounding social structure naturally dissolves. Low-signal individuals quickly find the environment unrewarding and move on to easier targets who will play along with their script. What remains in the wake of this systematic filtering process is a clean, undisturbed mental landscape. The rare profile recognizes that an empty room is infinitely more valuable than a room filled with people who require you to diminish your awareness just to keep the peace. By enforcing this absolute filter, they safeguard their focus, protect their internal baseline from constant contamination, and reclaim full control over where their mental bandwidth is spent. Behavioral asynchrony occurs when the internal operating system of an individual develops at a rate that vastly outpaces the surrounding social environment, creating an insurmountable gap in how reality is perceived and navigated. As a person's cognitive profiling abilities, pattern recognition, and threat detection capabilities reach advanced maturity, the social friction required to sustain standard, daily interactions becomes mathematically non-viable. Most people move through the world operating on implicit social scripts, pre-packaged routines designed to create predictability, establish surface-level safety, and signal tribal belonging. These scripts rely heavily on mutual self-deception. where participants implicitly agree not to question the motives, performances, or logical inconsistencies of one another. For the vast majority, this arrangement is entirely comfortable because it keeps psychological tension at a manageable baseline. When an individual's perceptual acuity matures, however, they can no longer participate in these scripted exchanges without experiencing extreme cognitive dissonance. Their mind automatically breaks down human interaction into its constituent mechanics, tracking vocal cadence shifts, identifying microexpressions that contradict spoken statements, mapping underlying insecurity driving conversational topics, and detecting subtle attempts at emotional manipulation. What is a light, pleasant conversation to an average participant becomes a heavy, high-information audit to the advanced observer. The information density of every room becomes overwhelming, not because the observer lacks emotional control, but because their brain is processing real-time behavioral data that everyone else is unconsciously ignoring. This creates a state of severe behavioral asynchrony. The rare personality type is, effectively speaking, an entirely different internal language while being forced to communicate in basic, performative gestures to maintain casual acquaintances. Every standard social obligation, the small talk at a gathering, the polite laughter at obvious posturing, the endless repetition of superficial status updates, demands a massive expenditure of energy to pretend they do not see what is clearly happening beneath the surface. To engage naturally would mean pointing out the hidden dynamics in the room, which would immediately shatter the fragile social harmony everyone else is working to preserve. Therefore, the observer is left with only two choices: actively suppress their awareness to play along, or quietly exit the game altogether. Sustaining the illusion of normal participation requires a continuous, exhausting act of self-suppression. It forces the individual to down-regulate their intellect, hide their baseline observations, and nod along to conversations that hold zero substance or truth. Over time, the cost-benefit analysis of this continuous performance becomes painfully clear. The amount of cognitive overhead required to maintain a single performative friendship far exceeds any potential value derived from the connection. The return on investment hits absolute zero because the relationship offers no real exchange of insight, no genuine alignment, and no protection against the friction of existence. Faced with its mathematical reality, the choice to step back into isolation is not an emotional outburst or a cry for help. It is an act of rational optimization. The individual simply stops absorbing the immense tax of forced social synchronization. They accept that their internal baseline operates on a frequency that the average social circle cannot accommodate without friction, and they choose to redirect that wasted energy inward towards self-mastery, strategic focus, and unshakable psychological autonomy. High-level observers naturally trigger a subconscious, unsettling discomfort in others simply by existing in the same physical or social space, a phenomenon directly tied to what happens when standard social masks are unintentionally rendered useless. The vast majority of social interactions rely on a tacit agreement that everyone gets to wear their chosen persona undisturbed. People construct these elaborate behavioral facades: the successful professional, the selfless caregiver, the untouchable expert, or the effortlessly cool peer, to protect their deeply rooted insecurities and project a specific, curated image to the world. They expect those around them to play along, validate the illusion, and offer the expected microsignals of approval in return. When a person who possesses deep observational acuity and calibrated self-awareness enters the dynamic, that entire transactional economy collapses without a single word being spoken. The advanced profile carries a distinct baseline presence. Their eye contact is direct and unhurried. Their body language lacks the nervous fidgeting designed to seek approval, and their vocal tone remains measured and unbothered by conversational games. They do not feed into performative stories, they do not offer fake laughter to diffuse tension, and they do not rush to fill awkward silences. This absence of performative participation acts as a psychological mirror. Without the observer making any conscious effort to judge or criticize, their quiet, immovable presence strips away the buffer between the other person's persona and their raw, unvarnished reality. The average person's subconscious mind registers this instantly as an invisible, existential threat. Because the observer cannot be easily manipulated, swayed by status signaling, or bribed with cheap flattery, the other person's mind immediately sounds an internal alarm. They realize their usual social maneuvers are failing to produce the desired result, which creates an immediate spike in subconscious anxiety. They feel exposed, as if the observer possesses an X-ray vision capable of looking past their carefully rehearsed scripts and seeing the unhealed wounds, hidden motives, and structural lies underneath. It is a deeply disorienting experience for someone who has spent their entire life relying on the complicity of others to maintain their self-esteem. Unable to force the observer to participate in the game, the people around them typically react in one of two ways. They either become defensive, attempting to find flaws in the observer to regain a sense of superiority, or they quietly pull away and label the observer as arrogant, cold, intimidating, or antisocial. They weaponize these labels to rationalize their own discomfort and protect their fragile ego from the painful realization that their mask has failed. They convince themselves that the observer is the problem, completely blind to the fact that their discomfort is being generated entirely from within their own unexamined psyche. This continuous cycle of subconscious rejection creates a natural wedge between the rare personality type and standard social groups. The high-level observer eventually realizes that remaining in casual social environments requires them to constantly manage the quiet panic of those around them. They realize that people do not actually dislike them for who they are. They dislike them for the clarity they bring into a room built on comfortable illusions. Rather than constantly down-regulating their presence or reassuring fragile egos just to keep the peace, the observer accepts this dynamic as an unalterable mechanic of human behavior and steps back from the social stage entirely. The transition from reactive social adaptation to sovereign energy control represents the moment an individual stops viewing attention as a currency for approval and begins managing it as a finite, high-value strategic asset. In the earlier stages of psychological development, most people are entirely bound to the feedback loops of their immediate environment. They respond reflexively to every ping on a phone, every subtle shift in group mood, every subtle demand for emotional validation, and every social obligation laid in front of them. This is reactive social adaptation, a continuous, low-grade survival state where an individual's focus, emotional baseline, and mental state are dictated entirely by external stimuli. They spend their psychological capital indiscriminately, constantly bending their behavior to fit the expectations of social circles, simply to maintain a feeling of safety and inclusion. When the rare personality type reaches full maturity, they undergo a fundamental paradigm shift regarding how energy operates. They recognize that human focus is not an infinite resource to be scattered across every trivial interaction that presents itself. It is the absolute foundation of personal power, clarity, and creation. Every time you engage in superficial gossip, every time you sit through a conversation designed solely to soothe someone else's unexamined insecurity, and every time you defend your lifestyle choices to people who have no real investment in your growth, you are leaking energy. You are allowing external forces to dictate where your internal power is directed, leaving you exhausted, fractured, and perpetually disconnected from your core purpose. Sovereign energy control is the deliberate decision to plug these leaks permanently. It begins with the realization that you owe no one access to your mind, your time, or your presence. The individual stops operating on a model of social obligation and shifts entirely to a model of strategic allocation. They begin to audit their days with cold, uncompromising precision, examining where their attention goes and what kind of return it generates. When they look at the modern social landscape, they see a system explicitly engineered to harvest human focus for cheap, fleeting micro-hits of validation. Choosing isolation in this phase is not an act of surrender or bitterness. It is an act of ruthless self-preservation and efficiency. By cutting off the constant stream of low-value social demands, the rare individual reclaims their entire internal bandwidth. The mental clarity that emerges from this total boundary control is profound. Without the constant static of other people's opinions, emotional baggage, and performative drama occupying their thoughts, their mind settles into a calm, steady baseline. They regain the ability to engage in deep, uninterrupted thought, to master complex skills, and to build an internal infrastructure that cannot be shaken by external chaos. They no longer care whether their choices are understood or approved of by the collective, because their sense of stability no longer depends on external consensus. This radical shift changes the fundamental nature of their boundary setting. They no longer negotiate their time, argue their position, or explain their absence to those who demand their attention. They simply retreat into their own space, holding their energy close and refusing to trade their inner peace for the empty comfort of casual company. They accept that true sovereignty requires complete ownership of one's focus, and they view their solitude not as a fortress to hide in, but as a sacred laboratory where their energy remains pure, concentrated, and entirely under their own command. True autonomy requires surviving the psychological wilderness known as the liminal desert, that quiet, unforgiving phase where you have permanently outgrown the default dynamics of average social circles, but have not yet fully constructed a self-contained, unshakable operating system. Most people spend their entire lives tethered to the familiar comfort of the herd. Even when they recognize that their social environment is toxic, superficial, or emotionally draining, the fear of complete solitude keeps them anchored in place. They would rather endure constant friction, subtle disrespect, and performative interactions than face the terrifying silence that occurs when all the noise is stripped away. The rare personality profile, however, eventually reaches a point where the cost of remaining in insincere environments becomes far more painful than the prospect of standing completely alone. When you make the conscious decision to walk away from low-signal relationships, you enter this intermediate space. The immediate aftermath of this withdrawal is rarely triumphant. It is quiet, disorienting, and heavy. In the initial stage of the liminal desert, the absence of external validation creates a profound psychological vacuum. The brain, which has been conditioned over a lifetime to seek social feedback, measure status, and respond to environmental pings, suddenly finds itself in total sensory isolation. The voice of self-doubt rises to the surface, asking whether you have made a catastrophic mistake, whether you are broken, or whether you are simply doomed to exist on the margins of society forever. This is the precise threshold where the vast majority of individuals break down and retreat back to the safety of lukewarm, unfulfilling connections. Surviving this phase demands a fundamental restructuring of your internal baseline. In the liminal desert, you are forced to confront every unhealed insecurity, every buried fear, and every subconscious need for approval that you previously drowned out with social activity. You can no longer rely on external mirrors to tell you who you are, what your worth is, or which direction you should move.